The Rebel Capitalist Show.
I think most of my viewers have read your book that is pretty much famous throughout FinTwit and the United States. And I know so many hedge fund managers that swear by this book, and it's absolutely fantastic, The Fourth Turning. But for those who might have not, can you just give us a short summary of it? And then we'll dive into some questions that I think are very relevant to what we're seeing today in the world.
Yeah, great. And maybe I should add that I'm, for everyone who has read or familiar with The Fourth Turning, I'm doing a new book. So that'll be sort of updating it and telling us where we are now. The Fourth Turning was written in 1997. So my God, I hate to think of how old that is, right? That's a generation ago, right?
Yeah.
So it was the second or third or fourth book, actually, in a number of books that I wrote with Bill Strauss.
Mm-hmm.
Back starting really in the late 1980s on generations and American history. We wrote a book in 1991 called Generations, the History of America's Future, which is actually a history of the United States, history of America, really from the early 17th century on, told as a sequence of generational biographies. And one of the things we found out is that generations have always been very different from each other, even back then, right? And we see many of the same generational contrasts. In fact, these generational contrasts follow a pattern. They keep coming up time and again. And it's linked to some of the large rhythms we see in American history that many people have, been familiar with over the years. And that is, we seem to encounter these great civic crises about once every long human lifetime, right? You go from the Glorious Revolution, the War of Spanish Succession, a huge event here in the colonies around the 1680s, 1690s. You go forward then to the 1770s, the American Revolution, the founding of the United States. Then you go to the Civil War. Then you go to the New Deal in World War II. And you go ahead another long human life, about 80 or 90 years. And guess what? Here we are today, right? And roughly halfway in between these great civic crises, you have these periods of awakening, these great, huge values upheavals, right? These are the great awakenings in American history, and we number them: First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, and most recently, the late 60s and 70s, which was a great awakening time, right, in American history. Young people rebelling against the establishment in the name of higher values, right? This classic awakening stuff. And that's a really interesting pattern, isn't it? And we wrote about that in the context of generations. And by the way, in that book is where we coined the name millennial generation. If anyone wants to know where that label comes from, it's from that book. And we kind of also sort of, screwed into place some of the other labels we now sometimes use, like silent generation, GI generation, and so on for other generations. So this was really what we worked on for a long time. And then in 1997, we decided to write a similar book, but with the emphasis first on the rhythms of history rather than on the generations. And that was The Fourth Turning. And we looked ahead. That's a book where we looked ahead explicitly to a crisis era beginning sometime in the middle to late 2000 decade, which turned out to be the global financial crisis, and an era that we expect to last a good generation. So, 22, 23 years, something like that. And so this era will be in for, through the 2020s.
And this era is the Fourth Turning.
Yes, this is the Fourth Turning. We'll possibly be in it to the early, 2030s, and it's a long period, as was earlier, many of the earlier eras like that we had.
Yeah, and it sounds like the other Fourth Turnings, they end in war. So is that inevitable, or can we avoid that?
Well, it's always been there, but the idea of a civic crisis is kind of part of the dynamic, right? You need creative destruction to bring stuff down and build new things up. And typically people won't build big new things unless they have to. I mean, I have to say it, but that's human nature, right? And that's why we founded the United States with all these new institutions, right? Like, a Senate and a House and a Capitol, and just all these new institutions. We built it because we had torn down the old system, right? We left Britain, but we had nothing really going, right? This very weak confederacy, and we were in chaos in the 1870s, right? Complete anarchy. The whole system was fragmenting, breaking up. So we founded this new powerful central government to keep us together. And that was a great founding civic moment. And we've done things similar to that in the later crises. We come out of that with a renewed understanding of what it means to be America, to be united, what we stand for. And we develop civic instincts of community, which last with us and actually keep the subsequent decades stable again. We're typically very unstable going into a crisis era.
Yeah. So, looking at today's world, there's a lot of social unrest. There's an extreme amount of divisiveness. I think you touched on that many times, and I'd love for you to expand on that. But I look through today's world through the lens of the 1770s and the 1780s. And I've heard you mention several times that back then, if you read people's diaries, they didn't refer to it as the revolution or the Revolutionary War. They referred to it as a civil war. Right. And it's because there were so many people that were loyalists, and then you had the patriots, and they were really divisive. And there was all this kind of guerrilla warfare that we saw between Americans. And when I think about the United States today moving into a civil war, so many people are talking about it. And I don't know if it's a civil war of tanks and bombs and chariots or something like that, but maybe more so of this guerrilla warfare, which we kind of saw in 2020. How do you see that?
Well, it's interesting that all of these crisis eras, particularly near the beginning, are characterized by enormous divisions in society. What happens is the old order becomes ineffective. Right. And then, of course, what happens is you have new people around new ideals building up these ideas of a new order, right? So you have these enormous political realignments, these new coalitions of entirely new parties, typically coming up with an agenda which is mutually exclusive of the other party's agenda, right? So you see early on in crisis eras always an enormous upsurge in polarization, partisanship, engagement. Everyone starts to vote. We've seen that now, right, with the voting rates. So the last two elections have been the highest voting rates in over a century. Everyone now, and all the elections across the United States are all being nationalized. No one cares anymore what's happening in your county. It's all about Trump or Biden, right? It's all a national. Every race is a national race. Could be for your dog catcher. Yeah. It's a national race, right? And I think that is absolutely typical of these periods. It happens every time. And it happened in the early 1770s as well. Suddenly, everything was about this ultimate decision of what you were going to do. And the differentiation between revolution and civil war, it's just a word. It all depends on your point of view. And you're right. The loyalists tended to see it more as a civil war. And there were a lot of loyalists. And the patriots like to talk about it as a revolution for obvious reasons. But you see in the Civil War, I mean, was it a rebellion? Was it a civil war? Was it an independence movement? You remember the South, actually, the secessionist states said, this is our 1770. We're declaring our independence from the Union, right? So in other words, it all depends on your point of view. Each party is trying to frame it for them. But all of these eras, go back to the Glorious Revolution, go back earlier in British and English history, right? These were all periods of powerful domestic division based on religion, based on economics, based on your values orientation.